Hello, welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming on the Onyx Path Publishing YouTube channel. I'm going to get quicker and quicker at saying that. I am joined here today by Mr. Christopher Allen. Hello.
Hello to everybody.
Now, this video is a bit impromptu, as many of my videos are, and the reason is because last week I uploaded a video about Werewolf the Forsaken. It was a bit off the cuff. It was a bit of a love letter to the game and about one of the books that I've recently been co-developing for the line, Shunned by the Moon. I waxed lyrical about how I love the sheer array of antagonists. I love the idea of pack and territory, and a great deal of Werewolf the Forsaken appeals to me, especially in its second edition. One of the minds, one of the creators behind second edition, who has been consistently on the line, is Chris Allen, which is why he is here at short notice with me today, for which I'm very grateful. Now, what I said in that previous video is I wanted viewers to leave comments that told us what they love about the game and what they maybe dislike or even hate about Werewolf the Forsaken. And maybe we'll be able to address some of those, perhaps give some ideas for play, for incorporation into your games, ways of circumventing things you identify as problems, or put our hands up and say, yes, this is something that really could do with addressing, and it's something we would love to do in a future book. So Chris is the expert. I am undoubtedly put to shame by both his and Leith Shields, who cannot be with us because he is our Antipodean chum down in Australia due to time zones, can't be on at this time. But what I intend to do is pose Chris some of the critiques and see whether he has any good ripostes for them. But before I do, Chris, perhaps you'd like to tell the viewers what it is you particularly enjoy about Werewolf the Forsaken.
Yeah, so Werewolf the Forsaken, for me, was the game that got me into the, as it was then, new World of Darkness lines. I had played a little bit of the classic World of Darkness back in the day, mostly Vampire the Masquerade, but never really got into it. And it was a series of posts on of the game line that sort of caught my interest and drew me in. And for me, I think what really works about Forsaken is the strong dividing lines and definitions, the way the game carves the world up along these boundaries. You've got the pack as the central unit, a foundational stone on which everything else rests. You've got the shadow and the flesh and the boundaries that are between. And the game is about transgression across these things. You know, it's about holding the line or not, or crossing over boundaries. It's a game about the mystical and the occult made very real. You know, unlike a lot of games where these kind of ideals and concepts can be very notional, in Werewolf the Forsaken, they're real. A spirit is a real thing. It can come across the border. It can infest flesh and twist the world, and that really worked for me, which leads into sort of the body horror aspects, which I'm quite big on, and paranoia, sort of occult paranoia. You know, Werewolf was always the game where you could never be sure whether your packmates was looking at you with their eyes still, or whether a spirit had taken hold of them, or whether there's a tiny little spider in their brain now piloting them around. So that kind of visceral feel to everything, thoroughly occult, thoroughly mysterious. The dark animism that had that roots in a very fleshy, physical kind of direct form really drew me in, with the first edition, certainly. And then obviously coming to the second edition with the refocusing, I think I had a lot of fun with the hunt, the new focus on the hunt, and how it sort of helped turn the game a bit more active, a bit more proactive. Because sometimes we'd run into issues with the first edition where Werewolf could feel a little bit passive, like you've carved out your turf, you're just going to guard those boundaries. You know, older werewolves became very anchored to a particular spot because of their essence bleed. And whereas with the new one, there's much more of a push to be active, proactive, get out there, do things, hunt, kill, change the world in the direction you want to change it.
Lovely. Well, there you go. If you haven't heard a good sales pitch for Werewolf the Forsaken yet, well, if you hadn't before this video, now you have. You've got no excuse.
I've just seen the comments about my beard now on the chat.
Yeah, no one cares what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I had to grow it to do the Werewolf writing. I wasn't allowed to until I had this beard. They were like, no writing for Werewolf for you.
I don't know how I got away with it. I was all shaved off for this video, naturally. So I would love for viewers of this video, and thank you very much, those of you who are tuning in now. I know, right, at this time is an inhospitable hour if you're over stateside. And but if you are in Europe, this is probably quite comfortable for you, especially if you're in Central or Eastern Europe. So thank you very much for tuning in, but this video will be remaining up after it's live. So in other words, you'll be able to watch it after the fact, no matter where you are in the world. My point being, please, if you have questions now about Werewolf the Forsaken or Chronicles of Darkness more broadly, by all means post them in the comments, and Chris and I shall endeavour to answer them. But before we do, we're going to go to the comments that were left on the original video, the one I recorded last week, and see what some people have to say. Now, we got over 40 comments, and that may not sound like a whole heap, but honestly, when a video that's completely unplanned goes out and gets that level of engagement from fans, what that tells us, and this is something we already kind of knew about Werewolf the Forsaken, is its fans can be rabid. It can really motivate people to be passionate. When you ask Werewolf fans their opinions, they are all too happy to offer it, and I don't mean that in a critical way. This helps us steer the game. And while we, of course, can't be subject to fan committee in terms of what we put into our games, we do like to hear what the fans want, what they like, what they dislike. And so without further ado, I'm going to read some positives first. And this was the highest rated comment on the video, and this was by Kaiser Affini, who said, and I'll quote this, "Forsaken only clicked for me in 2nd edition. Now its own brand of shamanistic focus makes me like it better than Apocalypse, but what really sold me on it was the forums. Chris Allen," the gentleman with me today, as I'm doing this to inflate your ego, Chris, occasionally shares new
much
spirit.
appreciated.
Well, Chris occasionally shares new spirits, antagonists, or describes sample locations. It's bone-chilling, fascinating, compelling, evocative, and makes you walk out of it abuzz with ideas for your table. He makes you get the feel of it. I truly hope he had a big hand in Shunned by the Moon. His hand was probably bigger than mine. What I love is the visceral personal feel to it, and how getting used to being an effective hunter makes you think in a manner alien to humanity. What I dislike is that picking up the terminology is pretty difficult for new GMs and players alike. This from a Mage the Awakening player, ironically. But overall, great game. I'm very happy with it. So let's address the first tongue before anything else then, Chris. It's something I've heard in a few places with Mage the Awakening, as Kaiser Affini mentioned, also with Mummy the Curse, when we have games where we introduce a brand new language. It runs the risk of going sort of planescape cant problems, where things can drift a little too alien and help prevent accessibility. So how do you handle the first tongue in your games?
Well, firstly, an admission, which is I really like the Planescape cant. But that said, while I am a sucker for that kind of immersive lingo in games, whether it's the Planescape cant or it's the first tongue in Werewolf, I think there's two elements to it. There's the presentational element, which, as he points out entirely correctly, the books can be quite dense with it. There's a lot of terms in there that aren't immediately obvious if you just pick them up without having any pre-reading, without seeing the lexicon, what they mean. And I think that is something to look at. I think that is something to think about when creating new content, is using the first tongue terms for flavor, but not overwhelming the text with them. Apart from a few terms that are very well established and very well embedded, I think it's definitely something to look out for, because it can make people bounce off the text. In terms of the implementation in game, once you are playing the game, I've generally found it's far less of an issue. I've never had a group who, once we've been at the table, cracking on with the game, getting in with characters, getting on with scenes, getting on with the hunt, have run into issues. Because to an extent, people use it as they are comfortable to. You know, people won't be always saying the Uratha, the Anshega, the Urdaga. They'll be saying, we're the Forsaken, they're the Pure, we're werewolves. Because there is that regularly used non-first tongue word, if people aren't happy using first tongue, they'll just refer to their characters as I'm a full moon rather than I'm a Rahu. And that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with not using the first tongue in your games. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just sticking to the regular terms. You don't have to be talking about NC and Dihir and things like that for the spirits. You could just be talking about more or less powerful ones. So in play, I found that the first tongue works very well to add flavour, but it's never been a limiter on people getting to grips with it at the table. It is in the books where it's both more important for giving flavour, but also more important to look at how it might cause people to bounce off, I think.
Yeah, and I would add to that, when I've ran Werewolf, for the most part, the characters I have using the first tongue more than any other, and whether this is correct or not, well, such as anything can be correct in a role-playing game, are spirits, because I try and make spirits appear more alien, and so I like to have them addressing werewolves by first tongue names, so that if your players don't use that often, it makes this, well, I'll reframe this. Spirits can, when portrayed poorly, seem rather bland, rather mundane. This is a spirit of a tree, this is a spirit of anger or whatever. But as soon as you start adding a different layer of culture to them, and that can come through as something as simple as language, it gives them age and it gives them mystery. And from there, various other things can follow. From a storyteller's perspective, I very much recommend people make cheat sheets of, and this is a good learning technique for any game, to be honest. Whenever you've got a game where you struggle with rules or language, the easiest way to learn, the simplest way to learn, is rewrite it. Just make a list of the most commonly used terms that you're likely to encounter, a list of 5 to 10 first tongue terms, and do the same thing with your rules. Writing them down will help you remember them, because that's you being active with them. And obviously using them at the table can be the same, but you'll have less pressure if you're actually writing them out. Beriorn says, Forsaken started out with the same It's Apocalypse But problem that Requiem had with its It's Masquerade But. But in its second edition, it started to be its own thing for the better. One of its strengths is indeed its vast array of enemies. Do you want a wolf versus wolf game? Do you want to face roaming spirits, people possessed by spirits, eldritch entities from beyond, the male djinn? Forsaken can do that and more. Hell, barring Hunter, it's got one of the largest bunches of monsters out of any Chronicles of Darkness game line, and even manages to beat out Apocalypse in that regard. Which, as a point of reference, is the main reason I love Forsaken. There's even the Purified, possibly the Pure, who'd make for an interesting addition to Forsaken as out-of-context antagonists.
Yeah, I don't know if the Purified from they're the Immortals, the ones who turn themselves into spirits.
Yes, of course. Yeah, my apologies, Beriorn. Now, as for an actual question, so here's something for you, Chris, because you worked on both of these games. How can the hunters from Hunter the Vigil stand up against the nastier spiritual entities from the Forsaken line?
Oh, well, that's a tricky one. I mean, Hunter is always about trying to get every edge you can against enemies that are often far more powerful. If we're talking about some of the spiritual antagonists from Forsaken, you do have the benefit that if you are playing the line straight, as it were, you're not getting the hunters hit with things like lunacy, at least, because we're not talking about werewolves, we're talking about the spirits, we're talking about claimed, we're talking about hosts. And how can they stand up to them? Well, fire's always a good one, the perennial favourite of many a group. But more specifically, humans have some tools in the core Chronicles of Darkness lines around exorcism, around banishment and things like that. That's worth looking at as a way to see if you can find an edge there. Vigilance, appropriate for Hunter the Vigil. Vigilance is really where it comes up, because a lot of the ways that the spiritual antagonists from Werewolf pose threats is their corrupting influence, their infiltrating influence. It's the way that someone you think you know stops being that person because now there's a rat curled up in their gut that controls them, or a spirit has sunk its claws into their mind. So I think the best defense hunters have against a lot of the spiritual antagonists from Werewolf is being as aware and vigilant and paranoid as possible. Not hard for many hunter cells. That's sort of the standard state of being, but that level of awareness, because that's how these things will get you. If you can stop something before it becomes a 12-foot juggernaut of scything spider legs and death, then you've got a much better chance of defeating the Aslu that's trying to take over your mate's body, you know.
I'll add as well, and this is a bit of a promo for an upcoming book. You, of course, make a deal with the devil. You have to team up, perhaps necessarily, with some creatures that you would rather see extinguished. In the case of a game like this, you'd be looking at werewolves as the enemy of my enemy. And to, I imagine, many hunters who are looking at things from a rather black and white perspective, as some hunters do, although it tends to be those hunters that go down the very wrong path quite swiftly. A spirit's shard like Aslu would probably seem more viscerally horrifying than a werewolf. The danger a werewolf would pose it isn't as it isn't as internal as an Aslu. So making an alliance with a werewolf pack is a potentially nice plot you could insert into Hunter the Vigil, and is very much the theme of the Contagion Chronicle, which is the book that will be on Kickstarter in the next couple or few months, the big crossover chronicle for Chronicles of Darkness, where hunters, werewolves, vampires, and so on are all in the same groups, the same factions, to do that very thing. So Thomas Mertens says, was a diehard Apocalypse player and storyteller, never got into Forsaken as we had stopped playing by then. Was really hoping they were going to go somewhere different with Forsaken than what they did. Second edition sounds like a much better concept, actually sounds better than Gaia's Protectors from Apocalypse. There's not a question there, Thomas, but I appreciate the support. Second edition is... first edition is still an excellent game, but second edition is what got me to get into Forsaken. So I strongly recommend anyone gives it a try. Now, the next comment is a long one, but we've got a few things that Jim Worth, the commenter, didn't like. So there'll be a few things for you to address, Chris.
Sure.
I loved the game since I first saw it. I was never into werewolves before. I liked the baddies of Apocalypse, but didn't like anyone else, and it probably only beat out Changeling for least liked among Old World of Darkness. Three big things I enjoyed. I'll try and be brief. One being the scion of this great history, Father Wolf, Luna, all the mythology. They're descended from gods. It's awesome. Two, the spirit world, which is creepy and crazy and dark and animistic and scary, but offers a whole nother Silent Hill-like playground for your games. And yes, I have to agree with that, Jim. People who play Werewolf the Forsaken, the people who seem to get the most out of the game, play a hell of a lot around with the Shadow. And that, as you say, Silent Hill-like playground. The spirits are weird and creepy and very scary. And three, the sheer amount of enemies. I'm like you in that I think antagonists really highlight a protagonist, and Aratha have a ton of really cool antagonists. So here we go, Chris, with things that Jim doesn't like. How dare you, Jim?
Hit me.
The things I don't like are few, but I think pretty telling, and some have been expanded on or grown from what others have said they didn't like about the game. One, the tribes are just kind of there. In first edition, Vampire and Mage got their own Covenant order books, but Werewolf crammed it all into Tribes of the Moon. While I think you can go overboard in getting the minutiae of detail about what groups are like, I don't think there's much of a unifying theme for the tribes. One thing I liked that was only touched on in first edition was how a couple of the Firstborn would sometimes make their presence felt to tribe members, driving them into a berserker death rage or inspiring them with an idea. Firstborn are gods stalking around the shadow, even as distant as they are. There should be more presence to them, like antediluvians in Vampire. Now, what's your thinking, Chris, regarding the tribes in Werewolf the Forsaken, where they potentially go wrong, how they could be developed, and how you use them?
So I think it's a very, very fair criticism. The tribes have always been in a slightly funny place, partly due to the fact they're called tribes, whereas what are they in some ways? They are more akin to a spiritual or philosophical paths than the kind of the ethnic groupings that people associate with the word tribe, which kind of puts them on a slightly funny first footing. But I agree. Generally, they are an area of the game that I think really could do with being made more compelling and being brought out in a way that really makes them much more gameable. I've had a lot of success using the tribes in my game as the bridges between packs, as the glue holding wider Forsaken society together, and giving a reason for packs and werewolves to interact across that boundary that's often otherwise very hard carved very deep into the game. And so for me, they are one of the two axes by which werewolf becomes the political element of werewolf comes out. And that involves, for me, that's always involved taking elements of the tribes that I liked and really playing them up in terms of the philosophical impact and that almost, as I said, almost faith-like element. You're not rival churches if you're members of different tribes. You're all on the same side. You're parts of the same greater whole. But how does that shape the individual werewolf? And I think that second edition did a good thing by tying in the prey, the sacred prey, to the tribes, and aligning that with tribal choice. I think there is more that can be done. Currently, the tribal presentations are very much about, here is what the tribe is and here is what it does, but there is less about why you, as the player of a werewolf character, why your particular werewolf would pick a particular tribe, beyond that it's the done thing. There is some content about that in the core, but it's not dug into very deeply. So for me, that is one area we could look at when you're really developing going forwards, is giving those compelling reasons, nailing them down as to why your new werewolf should go, I want to be a bone shadow or a blood tongue. Some people will see the tribes as they are and they will immediately ping for a tribe and they go, that works for me. But I have, I've heard from numerous players who've had a bit more of a problem grokking one or getting that grip. And I think looking at why, what is it that draws you into a tribe? And secondly, the comment about the firstborn is very good. And certainly an element that I like to play up in my games is the attachment of the firstborn. They are demigods. They are the kind of entity you can't just throw directly into most games, especially sort of street level werewolf games. However, they are there and they are active participants in the world. And my take on it is that any member of a tribe, while they may never have met their firstborn in person, you know that your firstborn is there at all times. The tribal bond is as real a spiritual bond for a werewolf as the immediate bond to your totem. It is there, it is real, and it is connecting you to something larger. And I think that's something we can look at, and the way we kind of draw that out and bring the firstborn in as sort of meaningful movers and shakers within the tribe. Not in the same way as an elder werewolf. These aren't going to be godlike NPCs sitting at the top of the hierarchy passing down commands. They are the inspirations for the tribe, but they're real. Like all the other occultism and mysticism and werewolf, it is real, it's there, it's physical. If you want to, you can find a firstborn and talk to them. And there hasn't been a lot of material about that. There was some great content in first edition. I remember one bit I absolutely loved was a note that the bone shadows, when they enter the shadow, they feel the sense of Deathwolf's breath as they go in. When they enter, that sense that she is there, she is with you. And I think playing that up really helps underpin the sacred nature of the tribes and makes them much more compelling when you know that there is someone out there who is personally connected to you and what you believe and is tangible. Even if you never see them, you can really feel their presence.
That's lovely, and to be honest, it's given me things I hadn't thought of before. I mean, the truth is, with Werewolf the Forsaken and indeed any other Chronicles of Darkness line, I know some people, especially in the comments to last week's video, requested a Lore of the Tribes style book for second edition, and such a book would no doubt be fantastic. You could delve into the firstborn for every single tribe, and there'll be a hell of a lot of depth. We could get into a lot of playability, but the truth is we can only really go ahead with pitching a book like that, getting a book like that approved and starting production of it, if other Werewolf the Forsaken books do well. It's kind of an investment thing. So we need to gauge how popular Shunned by the Moon is when it comes out, and a bestiaries are usually pretty popular, but we need it to do well. And likewise, we need Werewolf the Forsaken, the core, to keep selling. So if Werewolf the Forsaken is a game that interests you as a player or storyteller, do pick up a copy. It shows us that you're interested and want more books of this kind. So before we leave Jim Worth, his second point was there's not much in the way of advice for setting and story building. First edition had some things like territories, but it mostly boiled down to if they have this in their territory, then they can do that. While I appreciate it and also appreciate that everyone's game is going to be different, their player characters are going to be capable of different things, and a threat to one group is going to be trounced by another. Some sort of guide to help storytellers offer challenges to their players without having decades of experience would be really helpful. I'll field this one because it's something I specifically wanted added to Shunned by the Moon. It's something I felt was missing in Werewolf the Forsaken, and it was that immediate accessibility point, or jumping in point, if you like. And so we have a chapter at the end of Shunned by the Moon written by Leith Shields, who has also written a good quantity of the rest of the book too, as well as acting as co-developer with Chris and myself. And the whole point of this essay or chapter is to introduce you to the hunt, is to introduce you to different tiers of play in Hunt of the Vigil style, and basically excite you about all of the aspects of Werewolf the Forsaken that we love. That chapter, once you've read it, should, in an ideal world, give you a whole flurry of ideas to start basing your games around, including basing them around antagonists that are introduced in the same book. You know, we're not saying do this and then write up this monster, that monster, and that monster. We're saying if you want a story like this, use these characters and this plot that we've threaded through Shunned by the Moon. And so I completely see your point. There is a bit of a lack of accessibility that some people find for Werewolf the Forsaken, and hopefully that chapter will go some way to helping people get into it. So Jim, Shunned by the Moon might be the book for you. Next comment by Marcellus Hanjin. So here's the thing. I think Forsaken 2nd Edition is fantastic. It's not only tied with Mummy the Curse as my favourite Chronicles of Darkness game, it's tied with a handful of other games for my favourite tabletop RPG ever. The only thing that I can really ask for is more Forsaken. So to that end, you guys should be throwing money at Chris Allen to make more content for it. He's great. Well, thank you, Marcellus.
Thank you. Yeah,
if Chris is happy to keep working for us, we'll keep throwing money at him. Muss says, I really love the Forsaken game. The 2nd edition book is a blast to read, especially if you complement it with the Dark Eras book, which is superb. But it always seems to me a little off how you could build a pack comprised of different tribe members. So we get back to the tribe problem here, but this is a new angle at it. It feels forced, for example, if you have a mix of Blood Talons and Iron Masters in your group. It feels like their goals are so in opposite direction. It's hard to run a unified game and not a bunch of solo scenes with each player. I also really want to see how the Pure are revamped in the 2nd edition. Great video. Thank you very much, Muss. So, Chris, what justification do you have for members of different tribes coming together in the same pack? And can you tease anything about the Pure in Shunned by the Moon?
Yeah, I think I can do both of those. So the thing with tribes to note, and I've seen this crop up a few times since 2nd edition's release, is the sacred prey element. Werewolves in the tribe do not just hunt their sacred prey. For whatever reason, the werewolf will focus on that prey. They might have joined the tribe because they believe that prey is the most dangerous and the most threatening that needs to be dealt with. You know, there might be a hunter in darkness who has seen too much damage done to the gauntlet by hosts and simply believes that the literal underpinnings of reality being eaten away is probably the biggest threat of our time. Or they might be someone who has seen the damage werewolves done before they changed, and they think, well, obviously werewolves are the greatest threat. They might be someone who thinks these prey are worth hunting, or any of the other reasons as to why they focus, but that is not the only thing they do. Any pack will, throughout the course of a chronicle, very likely hunt and go up against all sorts of antagonists and rivals and non-antagonists that they end up in conflict with. And so in terms of the sacred prey clashing, the way to look at a multi-tribe pack isn't a bunch of clashing views, it's a bunch of complementing views. It's the case that you're going up against spirits. The Bone Shadow is the one who is most likely to have the expertise and the knowledge to lead the pack forwards in this. Throwing down with another pack, the Blood Talons in the pack are probably going to be taking lead, or at least taking entering the battle first. Dealing with Claimed, the Stormlords are going to want to push their way forwards on that one. So each tribe also brings a different synergy, spiritual synergy through the tie of its firstborn to the different gifts and different connections. A multi-tribal pack is one that has the strengths of all of the tribes, especially because of the way the Sacred Hunt works, which gives the tribal benefit to everyone in the pack. The more tribes you have to access, the more options your pack has, the more of a giant clawed Swiss Army knife it becomes. Now, the counterpoint to that is the philosophy, it's the faith, it's the spirituality. Do those clash? Yes, they will sometimes clash, but everyone is on the same team. Ultimately, they're all Forsaken, they're all in the same pack. And it's important to think about that at the end of the day. These guys and girls, your left and your right, they are your allies. They are the ones you trust when the chips are down. They may have a different opinion about the priorities of your new life as a werewolf, but they would have that even if you weren't werewolves. And that kind of internal conflict is part of the game as well. So I think it's a case that there will be some clashing inside a pack between tribes, but you don't need to really play that up a lot. You know, it's flavor, it's adding to direction, but ultimately tribes should ideally complement one another as well as clash. Now, the Pure. So Shunned by the Moon in the Pure. What we're not doing in Shunned by the Moon is we're not doing a big primer on Pure culture. You know, this isn't the Pure book 2nd edition. It's a Night Horrors book. So what we're giving you is we're giving you the tools to use the 2nd edition Pure and examples thereof. So obviously we're giving the gifts needed to the affinity gifts. We're giving some new rights and merits specific to the Pure tribes to expand them out a bit. And we're giving a series of sample characters of various levels of power for you to drop in and use in your games, or to fold, spindle, mutilate, bend, twist into whatever form you want. I think what I would say in terms of what Shunned brings to the Pure that's new, rather than simply giving you the tools, is what those tools imply. And what I mean by that is the 2nd edition core talks a bit about some of the tricks the different Pure have that make them more than just, here are some bad rabid werewolves. Shunned gives you some of those tools for those tricks to make them happen in play. The Fire Touched become the greater masters of shadow magic, of spirit magic, of rights. The Ivory Claws become those werewolves who have honed themselves to become something more and greater than the basic werewolf form. And Predator Kings become wielders of ancient Pangean witchcraft. So what we're doing in a way is we're adding some tools to help differentiate the tribes a bit more and give them different capabilities they can demonstrate in play, so that going up against Ivory Claws is different to going up against Fire Touched in quite a fundamental way. And how you blend them together means the Pure have a lot more tools and tricks to use as antagonists. So the storyteller has a whole load more tools in the toolbox they can draw from to make the Pure compelling and different as they want them to be. You know, you don't have to use these tools. You could have a Pure pack that's relatively normal by werewolf standards, or you can bring in some Ivory Claw tooled up with a whole set of merits and who suddenly isn't quite following the same rules as you're used to from a werewolf anymore. So what are we doing in Shunned? Mechanical updates, some great sample characters at a variety of power levels, but indicating some different takes on the tribes or some wider scale stuff you can drop in, and expanding on what the tribes are, what they mean. You know, the Predator Kings get hunger as their new gift rather than savagery. We took savagery out because it had too much overlap with existing gifts, and the new gift system doesn't really play well with having heavy overlaps. And I think the new gift there, hunger, tells you something more about the Predator Kings and who they are just by the capabilities it gives them.
Lovely. Okay, so next question is actually another statement. This one from Last White Elf. I think that's how you pronounce it. That would imply a campaign setting where the drow have done something horrible. I've been a storyteller of a live Forsaken Chronicle for almost 2 years. It was one of the best experiences of my life. The nightmarish spirit world described was a big challenge to represent, but we kind of did it. Well, good for you, Last White Elf. Now, here's a long one from Eurodivi Kiranov. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. So I'm going to skip your intro, but we'll go straight on to the bad. Now, one of these we've discussed, but I'll mention it again because it kind of reinforces that some people are confused by it. Tribes are a hard sell with the way they're currently presented, and the core focuses on the wrong things to help sell them, and usually splats the first thing people will focus on when designing a character. I think that, again, that's fair.
Yeah.
What Chris has been saying in this video, and what I agree with, is there's a lot of different ways to portray the tribes. You can make them as ever-present or overbearing as you like, but the idea of each having, if let's say we go with the example from earlier, where you do have a pack comprised of multiple tribes, or werewolves of multiple tribes, then you essentially have a lot of different clashing cultures and beliefs. While you have one core overriding belief system, you all obviously have a different philosophy of how you wish to approach it. And I think at its most basic level, that's how tribes can work for you. It will set the way you play your character off on in a direction that you don't necessarily have to cleave to, but it can lead to conflict, and conflict can be interesting. Now, hopefully, as mentioned earlier, we can explore tribes a bit more in a later book. If we can get to do another Werewolf the Forsaken book, I would love for it to be about tribes. The other point you mentioned under the bad is antagonists are often a little esoteric, and given how central they are in the spirit ecology, they really needed more focus in the core. So what are your thoughts on that, Chris? How would you bring the antagonists in Werewolf the Forsaken down to the more mundane level?
So for me, Werewolf has sort of always worked from even the mundane level as being absolutely infused with the dark animism of the setting. And I haven't had myself much of a problem with most of them being too esoteric, although certainly when you look at them straight up from the beginning, there's a whole raft of different antagonists, often very strange sort of position they hold in the metaphysics of the game. For me, it's very much about then concentrating on the direct impact of some of them in terms of how you portray the shadow. So my games have always had the shadow and the spirit world being very, very major parts. And that comes through in the focus that the gameplay has in my Chronicles. When the first time a pack enters the shadow is always a formative experience. And it's about interacting with the sort of something that's partway between Darwinian hellscape and a bizarre, complex society bound by pacts and laws that you aren't immediately aware of. So it's about enforcing the spirits as entities there that are horrible, but you as a werewolf are playing something that's part eldritch monstrosity yourself. So you are interacting with them on that same level. A spirit to a human is a strange and mysterious otherworldly force. A spirit to a werewolf is some bastard down the street who keeps trying to kill you every time you pop out your locus. And you might have to go around and teach him a bit of a lesson by breaking 7 of his 8 limbs. Or something you've gone out and you are trying to entreat via sacred rites to make a pact with you. But the way you interact with them is both different to the esoteric elements that humans do, and also how you as a storyteller direct players to interact with them can really shape the feel of the game. If you are constantly dealing with low-end, almost animalistic spirits and encouraging the pack to kick the shit out of them, you're going to get a very different feel to one where you are playing high spirit politics and encouraging the pack to interact with that on a political level. And you can do both at the same time. But I do agree that the second ed core, obviously, the space in there was limited, word count-wise, to really pack in everything we could about the antagonists. And certainly the shadow is one of the areas that I've always felt could do with a more coverage, more explanation for storytellers to draw from in terms of how does it work? What does it mean to have these broods here? To give people advice on how to do something more than just plop down a series of spiritual groups and then just have them be there and start talking about how do you interlink them? How do you build their rivalries and politics? How do you make them more of an aspect of the game that's something the players can go and engage with rather than simply sort of experience almost theme park-like? So, yeah, for me, obviously, Werewolf is about blood, gore, guts, physical magic, dark animism. So I think a lot of the antagonists plug into that from the esoteric level, but I think it's really a case of giving storytellers more advice on how to use them, which is something that could take up a very large number of words indeed. You know, I won't ramble on it forever here now, but certainly something we could look at doing.
So we also have some positives from this particular commenter. Loves the living mythology. Once you get the hang of spirit ecology, it's fun to make and helps set apart from Apocalypse. Game mechanics are exceptionally good and help sell the concept of being an apex predator without the characters being invincible. Now, this is a long comment. I'm going to say that this poster does want, for the love of God, a second edition Territories or Secrets of the Tribes book, or a guide to the hunt, which, as mentioned, we do have at the end of Shunned by the Moon as well. Pretty sizable chapter. the poster makes the point about doubles down on the point about tribes, and we completely understand what you're talking about here. Now I'm going to move on to another comment. Let's see, what else do we have? From Patrick Regan, I ran a 2nd edition game with the Dead Gamers Society in LA last year, and it's been quite a lot on my mind since then, so I'm actually really happy to answer this question. Things I liked, the weirdness of all the antagonists you could face. A lot of them are so strange and off the wall and alien. They remind me of some of the best kinds of horror monster design from games like Silent Hill. Second time that's been referenced. I like the concept of building a group where you build your characters, and think the system from Geist would be a great thing to update to Werewolf. I love the sense of history to all the tribes, the fact that Werewolf is riddled with myths and legends that they know are at least partially true, but cannot all be true, and what does it really matter? It's incredibly easy to see how these different groups still exist in other cultures. Their creation myths and myths of the Firstborn probably look different from us in the West. They're also true, because, again, what does it matter? Now, things I didn't quite care for. I felt a little bit of C for portraying the shadow. I could have used some quick sample spirits I could pick up and use as needed, a bit like in the Chronicles of Darkness core. Sometimes my characters just decided they needed to find a certain kind of spirit, and they're not exactly easy to build on the fly. And I'll go on to the next one before you can address that, Chris. Specifically, I think it'll be about portraying the shadow and the way you would advise people do it. But the big thing I didn't quite care for in the book, though, was that it was mechanically kind of a lot. I often feel like Werewolf is the most mechanically complex game, even more so than Mage, and it felt like a really high barrier for entry. With Mage, once you master the spellcasting system, you've got like 90% of it down. With Werewolf, you have your shape-shifting rules, each form special powers, 3 different kinds of gifts, rights, wolf-blooded powers, totem builder, and renown flaring, and the hunter's aspects. There's a lot of wonderful tools in the toolbox, but it's also a lot to keep track of. So that's a two-pronged question there, Chris. How would you portray the shadow, or how would you advise a new storyteller does so? And what's your advice regarding the toolbox approach of rules in Werewolf for Forsaken?
So Shadow, as I've said, the Shadow is one of my favorite parts of the game, and for me, like I said, it's about getting that cross between Darwinian hellscape and bizarre feudalism, and it's really about building some courts. It's about building structures. It's about looking at the way these things want to survive on a day-to-day basis and what they'll do, and then starting to sort of accrete and aglom stuff on that, and coming up with crazy concepts. You know, I've had all sorts of weird courts in my games. My Paris game had a big feud going on between the courts of light and darkness, and all the pacts and bonds they bound werewolves and things to sort of help keep that balance. I've had wars between artificial spirits and invasive plant spirits in the middle of a city, in civil wars inside fear courts between different kinds of fear, and that kind of thing helps establish spirits in the shadow as something to use quite effectively. And the totem, the pack totem, is a really key way of plugging people in, to my mind, because it's one of the ways you can immediately give them a compelling reason to get involved in the shadow. The spirit, your totem has needs there. Maybe it wants promotion in its spirit court and it wants you to bump off some guy above it, or or maneuver so it gains power. Maybe it needs protection, maybe it needs feeding, all these kind of things. But the specifics of what was asked were also about the mechanics and support for the mechanics. Obviously, spirits kind of use a simplified system with just the 3 main stats, but I completely get the feeling that, characters will pop into the shadow and you will suddenly be faced with a need to find a spirit type, and you won't have prepared it because you had no idea the players were going to do this. You had no idea where they were going to go, and you can't feasibly come up with a massive list as a storyteller of every single spirit that might be in the shadow. So my advice there partly is don't sweat it. Winging it is pretty good most of the time, unless you're going to get crunchy with an actual fight, and even then it's generally fairly quick to nail a spirit together. But it's about think about what's there immediately, what's there in the flesh, and bring that through and give it some attitude. If you're dealing with there's a road there, you can go, right, road spirits. And what are road spirits like here? Well, they're territorial bastards and they don't like you walking on their stretch of road. And then you immediately have a conflict, which is a spirit doesn't want you to cross over a certain area, and how you're going to interact with it. And what kind of things is it going to demand? It's going to demand stuff relating to the roads. Maybe it wants blood on the roads. Maybe it wants the roads fixing. Maybe it wants rival spirits on the road dealt with. And then the other side to that is not just the mechanics, but it's also, I suppose, referencing Shunned, Leith's chapter has a whole load of things with sort of quick idea list. It's simply, some of it's just there's some lists in there, things like resonance types, stuff you can quickly look at and go, well, what am I gonna, what could be here? Oh, maybe this is an area of resonance love. What does that mean? Well, there's going to be love spirits. What kind of love has been taken on in the physical world? What does that look like through a reflection? Again, it's an area I'd love to see more support for and more detail for. But for me, I suppose then the final point is the aesthetic of it. And that's always going to be down to the individual storyteller. I love a Geiger-esque, Silent Hill, hellish aesthetic of absolute weirdness in the shadow, where everything is just wrong, weirdly biomechanical or strange. Everything's alive. You know, the whole thing is a living, breathing place, one way or another. It's some sort of crazed Brian Froud / Geiger crossover. Faces underfoot, things in the walls. The air is whispering to you and muttering to you. And that's about how you deliver that to players, how you sort of deliver that sense of almost overload of this living world. Again, it's something I'd love to see more content for, so we can give storytellers more direct support. And what was the second question?
So the second question was, and I've just scrolled past it, so I'll just go back up. The second question was about the system. The poster believes that it's one of the more mechanically complex games. Yeah,
I agree. And it's certainly true, especially with second edition. Werewolf's got a lot more bolts and widgets attached. You know, like I say, we've got things like Hunter's Aspects. There's a few ways around that, obviously, house ruling stuff. Not every game uses Hunter's Aspects, or not every game uses Auspice abilities, for example, to cut down on the sort of front loading of powers. I've found in practice that some things tend to slip by the wayside unless players get very invested in them. I quite like the renown flaring system, but a lot of players will not notice it, if you like, at first. They won't really get to grips with it. And that's fine. It's absolutely fine to use some of the subsystems rarely, or not at all, if you want. The game won't break if you don't use renown flaring. The game won't break if you don't use Hunter's Aspects. I think there's other areas we could sort of tweak and fiddle around with it. One of the antagonists in Shunned by the Moon uses an idea that I've played around with a bit for Forsaken, for mainline Forsaken Werewolves, which is that it has a single health track that doesn't change depending on the shapes it takes. Its health track is simply the largest it has in any of its forms. So essentially a werewolf would always have their maximum health track that you would expect if they're in Garou form, for example. And that's something that I think might simplify things, because you cut away the whole thing of changing length of health track and shuffling dots back and forth or whatever. It means that werewolves are generally a lot harder physically. That's fine by me. They're supposed to be pretty tough. So I think there are a few areas like that that, for example, you know, the Storyteller's Guides, the Chronicler's Guides in first edition often came with various house rules and suggestions. And that's certainly something we could look at potentially in future products. Packaging up some sort of optional rules to streamline the game down a bit and make it a bit more immediately accessible mechanically.
Yeah, I think that would be beneficial for lots of games that we do. You know, some people really love that deep and involved character creation and systems where, as you say, bolts and widgets can be very appealing. People like options. Other people get choice paralysis and would rather have a slimline version of character creation and powers. And I think both are perfectly doable. It just needs to be seen whether that would be appealing to our audience, I guess. Oh, Mr. CH leaves a glowing comment. I'm not going to read it because it's quite long, but thank you very much for your kind words, Mr. CH. They're very kind. Something Awful, however, says they've got conflicting feelings about Forsaken. Interestingly, and this is something I've seen a few times, Something Awful says Forsaken first edition was my first RPG. And it's funny to think that, isn't it? Because I guess when you've got into gaming before Chronicles of Darkness came out, these all still feel a bit like new games, despite the fact they came out 20 years ago in, well, very nearly in the case of something like Vampire the Requiem. So yeah, it's odd to think that this would have been someone's first RPG. So what Something Awful didn't like, tribe philosophy is disconnected from favored prey. So this is maybe something you can go into a little, Chris. I like tribes, but a problem I found with second edition is how to integrate their favored prey. basically the condensed first edition tribes philosophies and just added, oh, and they think this is the ultimate prey, and there's a little correlation between tribe philosophy and favored prey, making some feel interchangeable. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a fair criticism. I think it's most true probably for maybe the Hunters in Darkness and the Stormlords. I feel the other three tribes have fairly strong hooks into their prey, into their favored prey by their default. You know, the Bone Shadows, Spirits was a fairly obvious connection. Blood Talons and Werewolves is a fairly obvious connection. And Iron Masters and Humanity follows on fairly naturally. Whereas with Hunters in Darkness and Stormlords, I personally think the connection is a really good one, but it's not as obviously there. And it is the case that you know, the core book had limited space for each tribe write up, and it had to get a lot in there about what this tribe is and what it does. And the prey is an area I would like to see more focus. Sorry, building the bridge between the prey and the rest of the tribal philosophy is an area I'd like to see more focused. If you do put the effort into doing it, it does work. But obviously, storytellers would prefer to give them the tools to do that rather than having to put the extra effort in. I love the connection between the Hunters in Darkness and the notion of sacred places and sanctity and purity compared to the defiling, befouling nature of the hosts, and why there would be even that just innate outrage between the fundamental concept of the Hunters in Darkness and the concept of the hosts. I really like the element of the Stormlords, which was added in, and is something certainly do with more emphasizing, is the Stormlords as the sort of the tribe that are most interested in inheriting Father Wolf's mantle, and hence the claimed are the most offensive of prey to them on a religious level, because they are the ones who are doing the most direct contravention of Father Wolf's laws, of the old ways, the old rules about the division between spirit and flesh. So I feel the connections are there. I feel they're strong connections. I certainly think there's something that could be played up more. And that will partly ties back into the why does your werewolf pick a tribe? You know, we've got a lot that says about what a werewolf tribe does, but building the link with the prey and building that into why your werewolf would pick a tribe, because not every werewolf will care about the sacred prey so much, but do they not? You know, looking at that is an area we could really strengthen that link.
Lovely. Okay, we are running short of time, so I'm going to ask the current viewers to start posting their questions, and as they do, we will go on to one further question by Something Awful. Now, I am going to say, for everyone that commented, thank you so much. We've got so many questions here that we almost need another video that, if Chris is amenable, we'll do in a couple of weeks. So Werewolf the Forsaken Part 2. But we'll see. We'll see how popular this video is. But it's wonderful to delve into a game that doesn't receive, well, it doesn't receive as much coverage as some of the other Chronicles of Darkness lines, and maybe we can lead the vanguard that will see Werewolf the Forsaken receive the recognition that it deserves. So the other point that Something Awful raised was the pure are confused between grey hats and black hats. Yes, I said is one of the things I like, but also I feel the writers don't know what to do with the pure. They want them to fit too many hats as antagonists, making them not good at any. At first they were clearly coded as a hate group, basically black hat antagonists, but then the game tells you that the Oath of the Moon says murdering the people is wrong, but also that the definition of the people varies between half moons, setting the seeds for moral debate about whether killing them on sight or not is good or justified. But the problem there is that they are clearly coded as a hate group, and that the ancient law of the Uratha frowns upon killing the coded hate group, but not on killing humans. So, well, actually, you know, I'll step in on this one. So I really love the pure as antagonists. They are awful from any, I guess, ethical perspective. I don't know that I'd go so far as to call them hate groups, although certainly they would be seen as such by a great number of Forsaken and human victims. My take on it is that their culture has been systemically drummed into them from birth, and that while that doesn't make them sympathetic by any means, it doesn't make them all that different from the Forsaken. It just means that the pure have basically been raised to be these, in some cases, homicidal, in many cases quite tyrannical, and certainly lacking what could be deemed human morals as groups. Would I call them a grey hat or black hat antagonist? I think almost all antagonists in Chronicles of Darkness have got to be grey hats, because for anything to just be a pure black hat antagonist would lack nuance and wouldn't be interesting to me as a storyteller, quite frankly, or a writer. And if anything gets there in Werewolf the Forsaken, it would be Bale Hounds, because it's almost always a willing submission to that, I guess, evil core that makes you a Bale Hound. So to get back to the point, what do I think of the pure and the way different writers have approached them? Now, I guess, defend that diverse take on the pure in this case, because I think that any tribe group in Werewolf the Forsaken needs a lot of different perspectives. There needs to be a certain amount of confusion. And while they may well justify their actions by saying that the definition of the people varies, and so we are permitted to sacrifice humans and eat humans if we so wish, there may be some other pure that are a little more refined or a little more cautious. And again, that makes the pure more interesting than just being pure genocidal maniacs. At least that's my perspective. In this coming book, Enchanted by the Moon, you're going to see a lot of different pure. And they all approach their lives as werewolves in different ways. They have their own problems. And while, again, I would hesitate to call any of them truly sympathetic, I would say that you get a nice glimpse of what it is to be an Ivory Claw, a Predator King, a Fire Touched, all the way through to then we start exploring Ghost Wolves and Bale Hounds. They're not nice. They're not meant to be nice, but they don't all have to be black and white, evil or good. And for that matter, Forsaken don't fall on that divide either. They're very grey as creatures. So we've got some questions now on the live feed, so I'm going to have to scroll up to find them. Oh, okay. Here's one for you, Chris. Metroid asks, I'm curious as to how you handle ammo tracking in your Chronicles in the event that you've had characters that use firearms.
Yeah, it has come up. Forsaken doesn't tend to feature an awful lot of guns in a meaningful fashion because werewolves are tooled up to take things out in hand to hand and are relatively bullet resistant as these things go. But I have had a gun bunny character in a Chronicle, and in fact, one of those things helped quite a lot because he had a fetish weapon, a gun that he could pour essence in and not have to reload it. So that made ammo tracking on that gun pretty trivial. Generally, I let players track it. You know, I'm not particularly interested in the minutiae. A player who has a gun will generally be looking at doing the tracking for it. It doesn't come up very often, so it's not a major time waster. If I am featuring antagonists with guns, which comes up more frequently with humans, I've got a fairly good head for numbers, so I'll just rattle through most of it in my head. But most scenes don't meaningfully last a long period of time to cover like significant ammo tracking for storytellers. It's a case of do they have enough left in the magazine before they need to reload, but you don't care if that Spec Ops guy has 5 or 6 magazines on him. And if it's the players, it's up to them to handle it anyway from my games.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're playing a full-on combat character and your character is based around being a gun hound of some kind, then ammunition it's less important. If you're playing a survival horror style game where the ammunition does matter, then I recommend having some kind of counter. I've ran a couple of games where I've used spent shell casings. That's quite a nice evocative way of people having their bullets in front of them. Usually not Werewolf the Forsaken, I'll admit. Usually it'll be some kind of zombie game. But if you have, a few bullets in front of the players and they've got to hand them over to the storyteller whenever they use one, there's a very real feeling of, oh shit, I've just lost my bullet and I've only got 5 left in this magazine. And then there's the surge of euphoria when you find a cache of bullets and you can start stacking them up again. But that's a good question. Not necessarily in keeping with what we were going for, but it doesn't mean it wasn't a good question. Okay. Killer2615 says, I know that crossover tends to be bad idea, TM, not in Chronicles of Darkness, Killer. That's what the Contagion Chronicle is specifically built for, but I'll carry on. But what splat do you think crossovers the best thematically with Werewolf the Forsaken? What do you think, Chris?
So I love using other splats as antagonists in Werewolf of Forsaken games anyway, and obviously a lot of them work really well for that. I've had some fun stuff with Prometheans, with vampires, a little bit around Changeling and Horrible Fae things. From before Changeling came out, I've featured weird Fae stuff in the games, and since then obviously been shaped a bit more by the game lines. For me, I suppose there's a couple of relatively immediate standouts. I like Changelings in terms of crossover with it, a sort of allied crossover rather than antagonist crossover, because I think that there's a lot you can do with the interactions between packs and werewolves and family and blood and territory and defense, contrasted against the fragility of a changeling's existence, even their perception, their escape from an abuser, and their attempt to sort of create a new life. I think there's a lot of interesting ways that kind of links together. There's a lot of stories you can tell there, and there's a lot of things that each party can look for in the other one out of that, which I really like. The other interesting one that I haven't really done anything with in my games so far, but I'm sort of looking for an opportunity, is Geists and Sin Eaters, because of the obvious duality with werewolves in the shadow and sin eaters and the underworld. You have the slight risk of running a kind of multi-otherworld ghost busting service kind of thing, it getting a bit silly. But I think fundamentally there's some underlying links between the different supernatural creatures that you can look at, draw material from, and see where they clash. So for me, those are the two that stand out.
For me, it's Mummy the Curse. I think it's an odd crossover because most people don't consider Mummy for crossover with anything other than maybe Vampire, because you've got the entire immortality angle. But I think from a cosmological perspective, there's a lot of crossover that I enjoy. There's a certain amount of clash. There's a certain amount of synchronicity. And as Chris knows, because he's been working with me on Mummy the Curse 2nd edition as well, I'm a big proponent of what do the Idigam have in common with the judges in Mummy the Curse. They are both a set of almost primordial, probably primordial, alien beings that might manifest in a vaguely humanoid way, but quite chimerical when they do. And they can garner worship. They've been missing for a very long time, and I don't know, in my little head canon that I sometimes seed throughout books because I think it's a fun I like crossover. I like seeding connectivity between books. There's that what if these gods, these judges that mummies are worshipping, are the same things that were locked away in the cosmos for centuries and are now starting to break out again. So yeah, I like that because it gives a reason to team up and explore this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, just if I can say a tiny bit about Mummy there, about the
please.
Edition, certainly the antagonist, the judge sourced antagonists, shall we say, certain horrible chimeric avatars. I would love to see a chronicle involving a mummy and a pack of werewolves going up against some of the things we've been creating for 2nd edition. Some of the real heavyweight antagonists, and seeing them throw down, because that could be pretty fun.
Oh yeah, and that may be something we've not even announced. The fact that you can encounter judges in Mummy the Curse 2nd edition. So there's an unexpected spoiler in this video, but the judges are one of the many antagonists in Mummy that may well manifest in your world in 2nd edition Mummy the Curse. So that should be nice and frightening to the Arisen. So a couple more questions and then we will sign off. So Mus asks, hello again, Mus. We answered your question earlier, but good to see you here for the live stream. Was wondering how would you handle crossover with Chronicles and how the cosmology would cross over? Well, the good thing is in Chronicles of Darkness there isn't too much cosmological conflict because unlike Well, so oftentimes people would look at World of Darkness and say there is no way that you can look at the idea of Gaia, Worm, Weaver, Wild, and so on, and somehow ratify that with Mage the Ascension's origins and the idea that the biblical Garden of Eden, Adam, Eve, Cain, and the like existed in Vampire the Masquerade, and you'd be right. The good thing is in Chronicles of Darkness, there's a lot more ambiguity. You can go with whichever truth you like. It's something someone commented earlier that we spoke about, that especially in Werewolf the Forsaken, every tribe has its own legends. None of them have to be true. And there is no system that, well, and by all means, you can argue this with me, and I'll be happy for you to do so. As far as I'm aware, there is no system-based conflict across any of the second edition Chronicles of Darkness games that would make you think, well, ghosts are presented this way in Vampire the Requiem, but they're presented this way in Geist the Sin Eaters, so the two cannot merge. We have made a very conscious effort to ensure that each game can be represented in the world of another. So crossover is definitely a good thing in Chronicles of Darkness.
Yeah, I mean, in my games, I always run a strict, the game line I am running is the one I care about, and the rest of the ones I will happily bend, fold, change, take rumors or whatever, and run that in whatever meshes best with the game line I'm running. You know, I don't care about the sanctity of the metaphysics of any other line for a Forsaken game, you know, and vice versa. If I'm playing Demon, I care about Demon, not about what Forsaken says about the past. And because of the toolboxy nature of Chronicles, it's easy to do that. You're not generally going to have a problem with another game's metaphysics crashing into your game line and forcing you to sort of play in a way that obeys that game line instead. I had mages in one of my Chronicles basically having been taught by one of the Idagam in the first place, and the mages were entirely horrified to find out that all their myths and legends were just wrong. And it's fine to do that. There is nothing wrong with taking any of the other lines and doing whatever the hell you want with it for your game line. No one's going to kick down your door and tell you can't do it that way.
So last question, it's one of the age-old crossover questions, and then I'll just give one comment, and this is from the same person. Vortigern Silverwood does say, I now regret not buying the new World of Darkness related books. Don't regret it, Vortigern. You can buy Werewolf the Forsaken 2nd edition right now on Drive-Thru-RPG, and we would love it if you did. And, of course, leave a review. Reviews are what help games get noticed. But Vortigern also asks, and this is the age-old question that I'm putting to you, Chris, have you touched on vampires? How would werewolves, I assume, handle gangrel, claws, and fangs damage or combat with vampires in general? So what damage does werewolf, what do vampire claws and fangs, and specifically protean claws, do to werewolves in your head, Chris?
They do exactly the same thing as they do in Vampire, according to Vampire's rules generally, which is, I believe it's lethal damage for the normal claws, and they have a specific set of circumstances under which it becomes aggravated if they frenzy and have the right merits. Because it's relatively straightforward just to go like that, and I don't have a big issue with that. It means gangrel can be pretty scary for a pack of werewolves. Werewolves have quite a lot of tools to use against vampires, so I'm keen for antagonists taken from other lines to be effective antagonists. I don't want to water them down and say, oh, well, werewolves are definitely always going to be dominant. I want them to be cool antagonists for a pack to face. So if that means they're going, oh, crap, it's one of the feral, it's one of the werewolf-like vampires, those are actually really quite scary. We have to change how we deal with this. It's like he's got silver for claws when he loses his shit. Brilliant. That is fantastic as far as I'm concerned. I don't think there's a lot of situations where the lines mechanically crash. It's just a way the storyteller just has to choose whether they want to take particular bits and use it in the way that game line presents it, or whether they want to change it. You know, in first edition, even though technically you weren't allowed to, I ran claimed vampires because the pack ran into an Elder Nosferatu who had been claimed by an electricity spirit in a very strange set of circumstances, and it confused the hell out of them. And it was an incredibly memorable encounter with this mad Nosferatu with electric spirit fused into their body. And that's what I'm always a proponent for. Do what you think will be interesting for the game. Don't worry too much about the sanctity of the game line in your chronicle. Do what's cool. Bend the rules. Take the bits you like, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's why, to go World of Darkness for a minute, in every Dark Ages game I run, I've well, not everyone, but in so many of them, I've introduced mages from House Flambeau. I've introduced werewolves of various tribes, and hunters from different cabals and the like. And the point being that they don't have that there is no authority telling you to adhere to the canon of any other game line. The only person who can decide upon that is you. And if you have a player who says, well, hunters aren't actually like that in Hunter, you say, well, we're not playing Hunter. So there's your answer.
I have one last question for you, actually, Matthew, given that it's a web stream. Yeah, I've got a question for you. What is your favourite entry, or one of your favourite entries in Shunned? What are you looking forward to the most?
Oh, okay. That would imply I've read it. No, of course I've read it. That's like
those guys who do the thing. Yeah.
I really like the hairy ones, the ones with the claws and the teeth. Oh no, it's the age-old question. It's like pick a favorite clan. There's so many very fun antagonists in Shunned by the Moon, and I'm very happy with the Gerayo. And so the Gerayo are what would be the best way of saying it? A prime form of apex predator, or patient zero is probably a good way of describing them. The father wolf's patient zero. And did they work out or not? There's certain similarities between the Gerayo and the Idagam in the sense that they have been locked up, or they have been forgotten, I think is probably a better word. There are certain similarities between Gerayo and werewolves and beasts as well. And they are the initial attempt to make an apex predator. Now, there's the lovely things about the Gerayo, and we have some that range from street level mundane, mostly written by author Bianca Savazzi, through to cosmological and terrifying, written by Mr. Chris Allen in this chat. And not while this chat's been going on.
Busily working away here.
And the common feature of the Gerayo is they're like mutants. They are like living viruses that just keep exploding and spawning into new faces of horror. In a very literal degree, a Gerayo might start spawning brand new faces down its back. It might start squeezing out brand new arms or legs or claws or fingers or teeth, and new eyeballs. They are the raw embodiment of what a shapeshifter could be, and that isn't a good thing. One of the things I particularly like about the Gerayo is you basically have two strains of them. You have those primordial hunters, but you also have the infectious version, which are all prevalent in Contagion Chronicle, where they cling on to that werewolf myth of transmission via the bite. You can become infected, tainted by the Gerayo, and unfortunately start exhibiting some of the same symptoms as them. So I love all of the Gerayo and Shunned by the Moon, and they are a brand new antagonist for Werewolf of Forsaken. But like all of the Werewolf of Forsaken antagonists, they can appear across any game. It's something I keep harping on about with Shunned by the Moon, but I'm particularly fond of the way this book is usable for a whole flurry of Chronicles of Darkness games, including Chronicles of Darkness Core. If you want to play mortals up against some terrifying werewolves or possessing spirits or mutant walking viruses, they all appear in Shunned by the Moon, and likewise would make perfect antagonists for Beast the Primordial. I could very well see them fitting into Changeling Lost as well. And I don't know, there's even some similarities, some ways you could insert them into Demon or Deviant. And of course Hunter. That's the excellent thing about Night Horrors books. They all work for Hunter the Vigil. Hunter the Vigil 2nd edition will be coming out with a whole bunch of source books already out for it, because Night Horrors for every game line work for Hunter. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to a simple question. And Arcade Kid 55, you say the God Machine is the only cosmological force I find difficult to fuse with other lore. Well, worry not, because Contagion Chronicle addresses that, and how the God Machine, especially when it goes wrong, interacts with other game lines. So the final thing I want to say, other than thank you very much to Chris for your time, thank you very much for the views and comments from all of you who are watching this Tuesday afternoon, and to anyone who watches later. The last thing I want to say, completely unrelated to Chronicles of Darkness, but related to Werewolf, is launching today is the Lunars Kickstarter for Exalted. That is your line of shapeshifters for Exalted 3rd edition. And I have no doubt that's a Kickstarter that will do very well. But that is launching today, the 12th of February. So be on the lookout. Refresh your browser constantly to get in on the fun pledge levels. And I do hope we'll see you there, because Lunars are my favourite splat for Exalted. And we will see a character creation video for Lunars on this channel in a week or so with myself and Neil Raymond Price. So with that in mind, thank you very much for watching, and I am going to disconnect this call.